Hello everybody, this is Heather Fryer, and I would like to thank Hakalau Jodo Mission for giving me the opportunity to share with you some thoughts about the connections between some of the biggest grassroots global peace-building efforts in the 20th and the 21st century and the plantation values that have given such strength and resilience and vibrancy to our life here in Hakalau and on the Hamakua Coast. So I'm going to mix them all together and present to you what I'm calling Building World Peace Local Style. Hardly a day goes by when I don't reflect on Dr. Martin Luther King's declaration in 1958 that true peace is not the absence of tension, it is the presence of justice. For many of us, the word justice evokes courtrooms and punishments. But King, a follower of both Jesus Christ and Mohandas Gandhi, conceptualized peace in the same way that peace practitioners and global security experts do today, in terms of what we call human security. It almost goes without saying that ending violence is the prerequisite for peace. But assuring human security is the best guarantee that a person who has engaged in a ceasefire will not pick up a weapon again later on, or that a young person in the next generation will never pick up a weapon in the first place. Peace researchers have identified 7 essential components of human security, of areas where if people feel as though they are safe and secure, they will be disinclined to engage in violence. They are economic security, of just knowing that they will have the means to earn a living and to gain sufficient resources to meet their basic needs. If your economic security is in place, you probably don't want to engage in violence in ways that might compromise that security. Food security and food scarcity is becoming a major center of violent conflict. Food security sounds very simple, as just a matter of having access to sufficient quantities of nutritious food, but that is very difficult for many people in many parts of the world. Along with that is health security. People need to feel as though there are safeguards in place to protect them from preventable health hazards or accidents, and that when they need it, they'll have quality care so that they don't have to suffer needlessly, and so that they can be physically and mentally well enough to continue to provide for themselves and to contribute and be a part of the community. Environmental security, having measures in place to prevent the degradation of ecosystems and the pollution of air, soil, and water. Peace and security experts are already seeing an increase in violent conflict due to water scarcity, and projections are that this is going to become a major area of conflict in the decades ahead. Personal security is something that we don't often think of in terms of global peace, but it's really important because people need to feel that they have protections against all forms of physical violence. I mean, of course, they're going to be inclined to engage in warfare if they believe that someone is going to enact war against them or their people. But they also need to have security and safety against things like hate crimes, domestic abuse, or rampant crime that makes going about one's daily business suddenly seem like a life or death threatening situation. Community security is very important, and we'll see an example of this in just a moment. Now, it doesn't mean that you have to live communally, and it doesn't mean that if you're kind of an introvert and you like your alone time, that you need to spend a lot of time in community. But what it does mean is that people have a sense of belonging within a community. They have kind of the safety and security that comes from being part of a community, and that they are protected from being alienated, isolated, excluded, or ostracized simply for reasons of race, gender, disability, age, sexual orientation, religion, or for any other arbitrary characteristic that puts them outside of that perimeter of care. Being valued, appreciated, and respected just for being a fellow human being is really one of the bedrocks of assuring a peaceful society going forward. And finally, political security, which is very commonly identified as part of global security and peace building, which is having protections against state repression and violations of human rights. People who have no freedom and none of their human rights respected have nothing to lose from picking up a weapon. And that's one of the places where violence is often started, wars are often started, terrorism often starts, even from people who really begin by only thinking that they're protecting the human rights that are granted to them by their state constitutions and by the UN Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So peace is complicated in some ways, but if you think of a lot of these conditions of human security, these are also things that we can affect on the local level. Let's look at some examples of how that might work. The best connection between human security and peace was not made by global experts, although they are very good at that. But in my mind, it was made by a group of Moroccan schoolboys in 2008. Let me explain. So you might remember that terrible day in 2004 where the commuter trains in Madrid were subject to a series of bombings that injured and killed a number of people. And credit, or rather responsibility, I suppose, was claimed by 7 terrorists who were working for Al-Qaeda. 4 years after the bombings, anthropologist Scott Atron traveled to the small town in Morocco where 4 of those 7 terrorists had grown up. They'd all grown up together. They went to the same school. Atron visited that very elementary school where those 4 terrorists were first graders at one time, and he asked the current first graders one simple question: who would you like to be like when you grow up? The top 4 answers, by a long shot, were Cristiano Ronaldo, the fabulous football player; the Terminator, made famous through international cinema, even if Arnold Schwarzenegger was less well known to them; Osama bin Laden, which is sobering but not surprising given the political climate in which some of these children were being raised; and, more surprising, the newly inaugurated President of the United States, Barack Obama. Now, when I first read this study, I admit I would have been hard-pressed to name 4 more starkly different men. But to these children who were raised in dispossession and destitution, all 4 of these figures represented people with infinitely hopeful futures that they could create themselves. Cristiano Ronaldo, the Terminator, Osama bin Laden, and Barack Obama didn't have to wait for somebody to make sure that they would be able to earn a living and eat a good meal every day, that they would have a doctor when they needed one, that food would grow on their land, and no one would dare mess with them in an act of interpersonal or ethnic or political violence. The other thing that was important here was that these kids also perceived these 4 figures as people their families and their ancestors could be proud of. The kids said this, and it tracked with something that Atron had found again and again over many decades of studying young people who become radicalized into terrorist organizations. And that is that for these young people, honoring the people who came before them is very important. That the thing that hurt them often was not the shame that they might have suffered at being poor or Muslim or the wrong nationality or whatever excluded them from the mainstream of accepted society. It wasn't their hurt and humiliation. It was the humiliation of their families, of their community, and of their ancestors. And with these 4 people, nobody was going to mess with their ancestors. So here's the greatest indicator of whether a young boy would accept or refuse to be recruited into a terrorist organization. Atron discovered that boys and young men who shared in a brotherhood, in this case the common cause of playing team soccer, were not likely at all to be drawn into terrorist brotherhoods. Especially successful soccer players would routinely prioritize staying with their soccer club over leaving their club even for the power and glory of martyring oneself to the cause of terrorist jihad, which we are led to believe is kind of the be-all and the end-all for a young radicalized Muslim man. It's not. Study after study has shown that when people's human security is assured, conflict and violence become unthinkable because people don't want to lose what they have when they have the means to sustain themselves and to build a future. Humans live on hope. They and all of us will seek hope where they can and will hold on to it preciously once they have it. So human security is clearly a precursor to peace, but it can seem like something that only world leaders or global institutions like the United Nations can really do anything about. And look, I get that perception, and to an extent that is absolutely true. We have to have good global leadership to make peace a reality in the world. But let's point out here too that history, including our own recent example from Morocco, shows us 2 things. One, that everyday people like us move the needle toward peace. We have in the past, we can now, and we can continue to do that in the future. Also, that the actions that have made a big difference toward peace are rooted in the same values that people have been practicing in Hakalau for generations. Our local plantation values, which were practiced by the people who came before us right here, are the same that have been used really effectively by some of the world's leading peace builders. They are, and I'm quoting from hakalauhome.com, engagement in collective effort, looking out for each other, honoring hard work, showing respect for those who came before us, caring for our land and its ecosystems, consistently showing up. Whatever has to be done, jump in and do it. Now, am I going to claim that all Hakalauans and all of plantation history have done all of these principles perfectly? Have they lived out all of these values all the time? No. And am I going to claim that I live out these values all the time and do it perfectly? No, I can't do that either. But what I can say is that knowing what I know about peace history, these values create for us a template upon which peace can thrive and on which we have a foundation to cultivate more peace in the world. Let me give you 4 examples of how that's worked in other times and places. Let me start with the story of the founding of Cows for Peace as an example of the power of collective effort. And I'll warn you at the outset, this story is really rough at the beginning, but it does get much, much better. So just so you're aware. Brigitte is a Tutsi woman who was raised in rural Rwanda. And when she was asked by a journalist how many family members she lost in the genocide, she starts to count on her fingers. 7 siblings, she says, 3 brothers and 4 sisters, and both parents. Stopping at 9 fingers, Brigitte continues, "I've never been able to count my extended family. There's too many. I don't even want to count." She goes on to tell the journalist what she remembers of the day she fled the village to escape the génocidaires. She shares these memories with an audience of 2, the journalist and Alphonse, the Hutu neighbor turned génocidaire who she fled that day and who led her parents and siblings to their deaths. Alphonse mostly sits quietly, occasionally correcting a detail lost to Brigitte's unfathomable trauma. War and genocide really do not end for everybody with a peace treaty. Rwandan peace builders knew this, but they were hard-pressed to come up with a way forward that didn't involve just telling victims and perpetrators to move on and put the conflict in the past. The organizers of the Cows for Peace project created a unique local approach to restoring economic, food, health, environmental, community, political, and personal security for Hutus and Tutsis alike. Participants in the project would start with intensive workshops on trauma healing and forgiveness. You can't just sort of tell people to just start working together and, coexisting. So they really had to work on this. But on completion of the workshop, every participant was put into a pair, and moving forward, 1 impoverished offender and 1 genocide survivor would share the responsibility of caring for a cow. Now, the cow would stay with the genocide survivor's family, but both share in the responsibility for caring for it. And in caring for the cow together, Cows for Peace creates opportunities for the offender's family to visit the survivor's home regularly. They have to. They're caring for a cow together. And through this process and these interactions, participants continually rebuild their relationships as they care for the cow. They're rebuilding their relationships around something that's real and that matters, and not just around an aspiration. The first calf that is born is given to the offender's family, which can make a world of difference economically. Hutu and Tutsi people become economically independent in mutually supportive ways that had not been in place before the genocide, and that make a recurrence an infinitely more costly proposition. Although it cannot possibly be easy, Brigitte and Alphonse are prospering together. They have taken impeccable care of their cow, and they have made enough money now from the sale of the milk and the manure for fertilizer that they have started to buy pigs together. And they have started raising other animals, other livestock, and improved their economic circumstances together. Every day, Brigitte is faced with a decision. Will she hate Alphonse, or will she renew her commitment, as hard as it may be, to caring for their animals together? Alphonse, for his part, resists the urge to run away to a place where nobody knows what he did during the genocide and to try to forget the past. Instead, he faces Brigitte every day. They are situating the genocide in the past, but the violence between them is not forgotten. Brigitte says for survivors, talking about the genocide helps. She says, because we got to know where those we lost are buried, and we felt comforted by knowing that. In that way, we felt peace. And today, a new generation of Rwandans has come into adulthood, and they have no direct memory and no direct experience of genocide, but they do know what it means to raise cows together. Cows for Peace really shows us the incredible power of collective effort. But the Danish resistance to the Nazis during World War II shows us two others of our plantation values. One is the power of honoring hard work, and especially knowing the value of your hard work. And secondly, what can happen when we look out for one another. Denmark faced an existential threat from Adolf Hitler's string of invasions in 1940. And to spare the Danish people the brutality of the kind of full military invasion that places like France had seen, the Danish government not only declared neutrality, but they cut their military force in half just to demonstrate that Denmark was very serious about staying out of war. Well, Hitler's Germany, which had a history of invading neutral nations, invaded Denmark shortly after, and they presented the Danish government with an ultimatum. Denmark must submit to Nazi governance or be crushed by the German war machine. In the interest of saving untold thousands of his subjects' lives, King Christian of Denmark submitted to Nazi authority. And although Denmark was now occupied by German troops, Denmark had not formally surrendered to Germany and, at least on paper, remained a sovereign state. Well, sovereignty meant a lot to the Danish people, including one 17-year-old Danish student named Arne Sair, who wrote what he called the 10 Commandments for Danes, which was based in his clear sense of the value of Danish people's hard work and the importance in a time of crisis of honoring it. Sair called on his fellow Danes to put in the least amount of effort toward enriching the Germans, to boycott German goods whenever possible, and to protect any Danish citizen from harm from the Germans. Sair's 10 Commandments met Danish patriotic unity, and the Danish resistance was formed. The Nazis tried to shut down Denmark's free press by prohibiting the publication of anything without German approval. But by 1941, an entire underground press was spreading Sair's 10 Commandments and other resistance publications, mostly by just printing them and putting them where some volunteers could grab them and take them to an upstairs window and throw them out on the street before anyone could see them. By 1943, illegal publications had reached a total circulation of 2.6 million copies, and the Danes were channeling their hard work into their own resistance and pulling it away from anything that would benefit the Nazis. Railroad workers, for instance, sabotaged all the rail lines that were used to transport Nazi troops, which emboldened Danish shipyard workers to sabotage an entire German cruiser. After which, the shipyard workers all walked off their jobs. Factory workers then walked off of their jobs in solidarity with the shipyard workers. And when word traveled to coastal towns, all of the workers from fishermen to police stopped work, closed their businesses, and gathered in the center of the city, where together they were unafraid. And where they knew that German troops couldn't kill them all because at some point they knew the value of their hard work. German troops responded by imposing a strict curfew on the Danes. And Danish resistors responded by ignoring it. They continued to withhold their work for 5 solid days until the Germans lifted the repressive curfew so that the Danes would get back to work. The Nazis were really not accustomed to so much successful resistance. So on August 28, 1943, the Germans gave the Danish government another ultimatum. Prohibit strikes, outlaw public meetings of 5 or more people, and prohibit any private meetings in closed rooms or in open air for that matter. Denmark would have a nighttime curfew. It would have to hand over all printed material to German censors before anything was published anywhere, and certainly before it was thrown out a window. And if that weren't enough, Denmark must institute the death penalty for any act of defiance against the German military or any German government authority. The Danish government refused. The next day, German troops took over key Danish facilities and they arrested newspaper editors, professors, and labor leaders. This was the German military occupation that King Christian had hoped to avoid. But it was also the occupation that proved that by knowing the value of their labor and using it wisely, the Danes were scaring the Nazis and pushing them back at least a little bit. Already the Danes had been very good at looking out for one another, but looking out for one another became all the more important on September 8, 1943, when the Nazis told Danish Jews to be ready to be transported to concentration camps. Non-Jewish Danes offered their homes and their offices as hiding places for their Jewish neighbors. And I use Jewish neighbors kind of in the loose sense. Often these were people who were complete strangers. Jewish and non-Jewish Danes sometimes met for the first time in this collective effort to look out for one another and make sure that no Dane, Jewish or not, was harmed by the Nazis. When the Germans issued a decree ordering all non-Jews to turn their Jewish neighbors over to Nazi authorities, Danish fishermen volunteered to ferry Jews to Sweden. To get the Jews past the Nazis, non-Jewish Danes who accompanied them would lend them crosses to wear so the authorities would believe the ruse that the Jews were their Christian spouses or parents. Everyone together risked their lives to look out for the Jewish community who had stood in solidarity with them throughout the whole of the resistance, in all of the strikes and in all of the actions. As a result, all but a few hundred of Denmark's Jewish population was safely removed from the clutches of the Nazi. And there was a very, very small, though still tragic, but small percentage who did not escape the Nazis. The German troops responded to all of these strikes and all of these actions on the part of the Danes with increased arrests, another 8 p.m. curfew, violence, and heightened numbers of German troops brought into Danish cities and towns. The Danish police were arrested for failing to stop sabotage, and German troops took over controlling the cities of Denmark. But in response to the arrest of police workers, the Danish Freedom Council called for another nationwide strike to take place later that week. Danish workers launched the Go Home Early campaign, in which they left their jobs before the end of the workday. And they would say to a Nazi who asked them why they were leaving their job that they had to go home to tend their vegetable gardens because the Nazis' 8 p.m. curfew didn't give them enough time outside to tend their victory gardens after work before sundown. They started 2-minute-long work stoppages, which put a little tiny dent in productivity and promoted continued cohesion and looking out for one another. The Danes continually honored hard work by recognizing its power and putting their skills and efforts toward peace instead of repression and war from the Nazis. When word of Hitler's death reached Denmark on May 1st, 1945, Danes everywhere rejoiced in the fact that the occupation would end and that Germany really didn't get very much of what it wanted from Denmark. Although their nonviolent methods of resistance had not ended the occupation right away, through this resistance, the Danes had protected Danish Jews, maintained the sovereignty of their national government through the occupation, and limited the human resources of Danish time, talent, labor, skill, and expertise that Germany could steal from them and channel into their war effort. They had, in a very, very big way, contributed to peace. The Green Belt movement of the 1970s in Kenya is a great example of how care for the land really connects to human security and to peace. And this is actually a peace-building movement that started as local and now has international dimensions. It began with Wangari Maathai's observations in her work as a political activist that behind the everyday hardships of the poor in Kenya, there were much deeper issues beyond how much money they might have in their pockets. There were issues of disenfranchisement from politics, of being marginalized from centers of decision-making in their communities. And underneath even that was a loss of a set of traditional Kenyan values that had previously enabled communities to work together to protect their environment and to steward land and resources for mutual benefit. Of course, with the arrival of the British Empire, that changed so that land and resources really went for the power and the benefit of imperial interests or post-colonial elites, or for corporations that profited from African lands. Maathai organized public seminars in civic and environmental education and was struck by the consistency with which the people who participated would share a realization that they had been placing their trust in leaders, whether it was political rulers or corporate employers or experts from abroad, who had betrayed them instead of working for the common good and working toward making natural resources available wisely and widely. These insights that came out of these conversations formed the core of the Green Belt movement, which is rooted in the belief that true peace lies in ensuring respect for the life and dignity of each human being. And that depends on respecting the health of the environment and of participating in the judicious and sensible management of resources, whether that's land, water, or other resources, as well as the incomes that are derived from them. So this might be things like profits from mineral leases or petroleum or agricultural goods. Maathai started leading groups, first of mostly women, in doing one simple thing, and that was planting trees. And as these women gathered to plant trees, they would engage in community-based environmental conservation that became wider and involved more people and more land. The Green Belt movement started to encourage the women to work together to grow seedlings and to plant trees to bind the soil and to plant trees in ways to store rainwater. They started looking at tree planting as a way to really provide food, to provide firewood, and all of these efforts just through planting trees linked environmental sustainability, human security, and reduced interethnic and political tensions among Kenyans who did live in a certain amount of conflict over the decades prior to this shift in attention toward everybody's shared natural environment rather than their political grievances. Greenbelt participants grew in numbers, they planted more trees, and increasingly they started to speak out against land grabbing and interests from outside Kenya that thwarted the progress that they were making from their just meticulous and measured and consistent planting of trees. More and more people started to feel that they had the power to push back against plans to extend commercial agriculture into their forests. The Greenbelt movement launched its Billion Tree campaign and has planted 51 million trees in Kenya. And the project was so successful that they launched another one in the Congo Basin forest ecosystem. Now, the Congo is also a place that has had difficulty with protracted political conflict and happens to be the world's second lung after the Amazon rainforest. So the world breathes better because the Greenbelt movement responded to the global loss of habitable, sustainable human habitat just by gathering first women together, planting trees together side by side, right in the place where they were, and as they did, demanding more sustainable human security. I opened with a quote from Martin Luther King, who was, of course, a great light in the U.S. civil rights movement. Now, many of us have heard of the Freedom Riders and the Congress for Racial Equality, but we don't often hear about Woman Power Unlimited. Woman Power Unlimited was established in Jackson, Mississippi in the early 1960s by Claire Collins Harvey, who was a member of Jackson's Black elite and was not in the circles of people who were going to jail for acts of civil disobedience against unjust segregation laws. She, like most African Americans, didn't exactly know what to make of the first of the young black and white civil rights activists who were doing things like riding in the front of the bus together in states where it was illegal for black and white people to sit side by side. These activists became targets of arrest for civil disobedience and targets of violence from segregationists. Many local people, like Claire Collins Harvey, knew that being seen as supporting a challenge to the white power structure in the South seemed the surest way to be killed. African Americans had no assurances of their personal, community, or political security in the years before the Civil Rights Revolution. Harvey could donate money, but most people in the black community could not. Racial discrimination made economic, food, and health security very precarious, and for women it was even more so. Harvey began organizing local women to start thinking about what they could do instead of just feeling overwhelmed by what they could not. She and the members of what became Woman Power Unlimited gathered and delivered things that civil rights workers would need when they got out of jail. Things like fresh clothing, blankets, news magazines, food, and pens and paper. Some of the people in Women Power Unlimited would deliver messages to the families of incarcerated civil rights activists, using elaborate means to pass these messages along, sometimes person to person, so that no one black person could be identified as the person who was running the messages or as somebody who was supporting desegregation. During Freedom Summer, activists would sometimes wake to find home-cooked food delivered to their doorstep under the cover of night with no indication of who cooked it or who carried it. Neighbors served as eyes and ears, sending anonymous tips about dangers to civil rights workers, providing the human security that activists needed just to assure their human security of African Americans in the Deep South one day. Over time, Woman Power Unlimited had expanded its operation to consistently show up and whatever has to be done, jump in and do it. And they were providing direct support to Martin Luther King himself. And yet they never failed to support activists like Tougaloo College student Ann Moody, who recalled in her autobiography that the families in Mississippi who were reluctant to even speak to her or to look at her fellow activists on the streets were the same ones who fed her in body and spirit when they quietly dropped off baskets of fried chicken and biscuits and jugs of sweet tea, and sometimes a note of warning if danger was coming. The food was nourishing, the warnings were life-saving, and the expressions of care were fortifying. Historian John Dittmer and many civil rights activists have since said that without these networks of support, without Woman Power Unlimited simply showing up consistently and whatever having to be done, jumping in and doing it, that the civil rights movement would not have been as effective as it was. Nobody had to lead a march on Washington or run for public office or go to jail for the cause if they were not able to do so. Woman Power United gave people a way to do what they usually did, was just to jump in and do what needs to be done, to show up where they could, even if it was difficult or uncomfortable. And plantation neighbors always did the same. There's a saying here, if there is a need, you go. And in Hakalau, people have done that for generations. We do what we can right from where we are. One of the things that we learn from that is what people in Woman Power Unlimited learned, and in the Green Belt movement, and in the Danish resistance, and at Cows for Peace. We have everything in place to be powerful and to move the needle toward peace. Hakalau's plantation values of working together, watching out for one another, valuing all who live here, and caring for the land is a continuation of the practices of hard work, neighborliness, resourcefulness, and making an extended family of the strangers from many countries who came together to produce sugar. All of this is part of our life here, and it still is woven into the fabric of our social landscape. What we have in common with the global peace movements that seem so far away in time and place is that they too are woven from the fabric of everyday life. Cows for Peace, the Danish resistance, the Green Belt movement, and Woman Power Unlimited tipped the balance from war and conflict and violence toward peace and mutual cooperation by mobilizing the strengths of their communities in the service of human security. If we live in a manner that supports human security, we create more human security in the world. It is a way to show respect for those who came before us, to care for those who will follow us, and to catalyze peace for all of us in today's troubled world. We in Hakalau live on a horizon of hope. Thank you. Thank you for taking the time to listen, and I wish you peace.